If you're a software developer, you are probably familiar with the terms junior and senior developer. These terms are used to refer to the amount of experience a given developer has. On average, developers are categorized as junior in their first 3 years of their career. After these 3 years, they move into an intermediate state where they are not really junior anymore and not really senior yet. And after the 5th year, they start moving into the senior developer category. However, I believe there is a level after senior developer, and I call this level veteran developer. In this video, I will explain what I believe the difference is between the senior and veteran developer levels. The kinds of knowledge that you acquire throughout your career as a developer typically fall within 3 categories. And I have described these categories as technique, doctrine, and rationale. Technique knowledge covers stuff like how to do a certain thing, like how to create a class, how to create a method, how to call methods, inheritance, recursion, loops, variables, dependency injection, design patterns, and a lot of other things. So in short, technique means how to do something in your programming language and your tools and your whole platform in general. The doctrine category of knowledge contains rules like never do this, always do this, when X, then Y, etc. In short, when to use a certain technique and when not to use a certain technique. And best practices also fall within this category. The rationale category of knowledge contains the why behind the doctrines, behind the rules. So you start to understand that the reason you should never do this or that is that because when you do that, it causes a certain problem. But what you typically also learn at this level is that it is not in all situations that doing X, Y, Z will actually cause that problem. So you start to learn in which situations a certain technique or a certain way of designing your code will cause the problem and when not, or in which situations you will get a certain benefit from designing your code in a certain way and when not. So you are learning the pros and cons of different techniques, but you're also learning the limitations of the rules at the doctrine level. You are learning when it is okay to break the rules at the doctrine level. Developers do not typically learn technique, doctrine, and rationale all at once. A new developer will typically start out by focusing on techniques, about how to do certain things. After some years of learning techniques and getting really familiar with these techniques, the developer starts moving into the senior level here, where the developer starts learning all the doctrines, all the rules about when to use a certain technique and when not to. And after some years adhering to the doctrine and using the techniques, the developer starts learning when these doctrines can, when they make sense and when they don't make sense, when the rules can be broken and when not. The main difference between the senior and the veteran developer levels is, as illustrated here, the amount of rationale that the given developer has learned, and that veteran developers tend to rely more on their own reasoning than on blind adherence to doctrine. Obviously, in practice, a junior developer might, of course, start learning some doctrine already, even in their first year. And a senior developer might learn some rationale already in the beginning of their senior periods. However, in my experience, junior developers tend to focus mostly on technique, less on doctrine, and least on rationale. Senior developers tend to still focus a lot on technique. There's still a lot to learn, but also a lot on doctrine and a little bit on rationale. and veteran developers tend to focus mostly on technique and on rationale, not so much on doctrine anymore, because once you reach the veteran level, as I mentioned earlier, you do not need to rely so much on the doctrine anymore. The different stages of a developer's career tend to impact the developer's focus and often also their behavior. Junior developers are typically focused on learning. Being in a learning phase of their career, they tend to mimic the behavior of the more experienced developers around them. Junior developers typically do not feel confident enough about their knowledge level yet to be dictating or suggesting terms to their colleagues. Senior developers tend to be far more confident in their knowledge and skill levels, and thus often more eager to claim their spot in the sunlight. This confidence and eagerness often leads senior developers to be more dogmatic. They want to adhere to all the doctrines they have learned, such as clean code, test-driven development, domain-driven design, etc. And so they preach and push these ideas whenever possible. Exactly how pushy a given senior developer is, of course, also depends on the ego of that developer. However, the confidence of senior developers often lead to a higher ego at this stage of their career. Often, but not always, of course. Senior developers also tend to be technology-driven, wanting to use the latest and greatest technologies released by the big companies such as Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, etc. This sometimes turns into what is known as CV-driven development, where developers choose technologies based on what will look good on their CV and not based on what will solve the problem best. Veteran developers tend to be more pragmatic, having seen enough new technologies being sold as the next silver bullet, only to fade away into oblivion when the industry either realized that tech was not a silver bullet or even outright a bad idea. Veteran developers tend to focus on getting the job done, even if it means breaking a rule or two and not using the latest, greatest trendy tools. Veteran developers tend to prefer effective code over clean code, and they tend to be more business-driven than technology-driven. Where senior developers have a tendency to prefer high-tech, veteran developers have a tendency to prefer low-tech, simple solutions. Veteran developers tend to have lower egos, or at least to be able to keep their egos more in check. They tend to be more accepting and forgiving of imperfection, knowing both that perfection is not always necessary and that everyone makes mistakes, especially when learning. The different priorities of senior and veteran developers can sometimes lead to attitude issues. Senior developers may feel that veteran developers have not stayed up to date with the latest techniques, processes, and best practices, sometimes leading senior developers to label veteran developers as obsolete dinosaurs who are just punching their clock for a salary. Veteran developers, on the other hand, may feel that senior developers have the wrong priorities, that they are chasing shiny objects and being unnecessarily perfectionist and even outright delusional, rather than focusing on solving the problem and meeting the needs of the business in terms of deadlines and budgets, etc. As you can imagine, this may lead to a culture clash between senior and veteran developers. Senior developers may also sometimes have a bad attitude towards junior developers. Whether this is due to feeling superior or feeling threatened, or senior developers' often strong desire to adhere strictly to the doctrine, which junior developers naturally often fail to do, or due to some other reason, I don't really know. I guess that depends on the individual and the situation. What is interesting though is that it seems that junior and veteran developers are more compatible attitude-wise, with juniors being eager to learn from someone with long experience, and with veterans being more forgiving of the errors of the junior developers. Veteran developers also tend to feel less threatened by junior developers because their knowledge and experience levels are so different that a comparison often doesn't really make sense. Finally, I just want to say that I did not make this video to demonize senior developers. Being senior developer is a phase that all developers go through. I made this video to share with you why I believe there is a developer experience level beyond senior developer, and what I believe the difference is between senior and veteran developers, based on my own experience and observations. I have seen many of my own colleagues go through these phases during their own careers. Also, don't get hung up on the exact year boundaries of each experience level. Those are just loose estimates. Whether you become a senior at 4 years, 5 years or 6 years, or a veteran at 10 years, 12 years or 14 years is not really the point. The only thing I would say is that I don't believe it is possible to go directly from junior developer to veteran. Becoming a veteran developer seems to be something that happens with lots and lots of real-world practical developer experience. It is not just a mindset you can choose to have, but a mindset that comes after you have achieved a certain skill set, skill level, and experience level. Now I'm very curious to hear what you think, so please let me know in the comments below what you think of the idea of the veteran developer level, and also my definition of junior, senior, and veteran developers. Whether you think I'm right, or that I'm wrong, or what experiences you have had yourself throughout your own developer career. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this.